Andy, this one's for you. With regards to budget and finance, when forecasting finance, do we consider the finance team as part of the development team or vice versa?
This is a trick question. Somebody threw this in here just to confuse us.
I'm wondering I'm trying to understand exactly what it's asking. So
depending on the size of your organization, I'm going to try to answer it honestly. Depending on the size of your organization, who reports to who and who's responsible for what it could be, the answer is infinite. If you're tiny and you're totally board run and you don't even have an executive director, it's everybody's responsibility to do everything. The larger you get, the more departments you have, and you start to split those out into sort of common functional areas. You end up with and finance is usually almost last. You see these organizations grow and then you finally get a finance team. That's you're a big boy because now you got a finance team. Would they do they even have a relationship to the development team? I don't think so. The development team has a sort of revenue responsibility. Their job is to bring in contributions, and the finance team their job is to make sure that all of the accounting gets done properly and that you've got, you're thinking ahead far enough that you don't run out of cash. Those are the two different jobs. Do they overlap? Sure, they overlap because everything has to do with money, but that's true in any nonprofit. Everybody has some responsibility for money at some point. But do they need to report to each other, or do they one report to the other, or is that common? I don't think so. I think it's really unusual.
Those feel like two very distinct functions within an organization from everything I've ever seen. And I guess the only thing I could think of, and I was wondering if this is where the question was headed, when they said when forecasting finance, I started thinking, okay, if they're talking about budget forecasting and, forecasting sort of just revenue generation, it absolutely should be driven by the development department to come up with those numbers. Finance could check those numbers or ask questions around those numbers or try to see, check the assumptions of those numbers for budget purposes. But finance wouldn't be the one to say, oh, we need to make this much money, so we're going to plug in this hole and then give it to you, development. And so that was the other thing I was trying to figure out, if that's what the question was asking. I feel a little unclear. So my apologies if the person who wrote this, if we're not hitting the nail on the head, and if there's any more, if there's any more context you want to provide. But those are just two separate and distinct.
Yeah, I agree. And to, if the question is about who is responsible for the development team's forecasts for the upcoming fiscal year, it should be 100% the development team.
Yeah.
Nobody knows that better than they do. And that's something you see that is a common challenge, is when exactly what you said, the development team says, yeah, we think we can raise, $650,000 this year. And they get their budget back and it's you get to raise $1 million. Well, okay. Then don't be surprised when we suck at that, because that's not what we said we could do. That's always a push-pull, but it really needs to be driven by the department that says, they have to come up with exactly how that's going to happen. You can't just throw numbers at them and expect them to meet them. That's crazy.
And you in your roles over the years and finance roles, I'm guessing you probably were the one that would ask, where did these numbers come from? They seem a little not ambitious enough, or maybe it's not, ambition isn't the right word, but not, you have projected no growth. Why is that, right? So I would think the finance team could ask those kinds of questions for better context, or if there's variances from year to year, or there's gaps, funding gaps. To me, that's where I see the two intersecting and having a conversation, and absolutely a partnership to some degree, because each hand needs to be talking to the other. But it definitely feels like two very distinct responsibilities, unless you've come up with some really creative solution where you have someone who is wearing all hats, like some nonprofits do, right? And wearing the finance hat and the development hat, but that's not the way the question reads.
Mm-mm. And it's sort of, to answer your question, the way I prefer to do any kind of budgeting for revenue is it's all just based on science and numbers. So there's never any, what do you think? Or what's your opinion? Or what's your guess? It's like, if we're talking about direct mail, we have very clear understanding of exactly how direct mail works. We know the size of our file. We know what happened last year. So we know what's going to happen this year, like within a few boundaries, right? If we're talking about major gifts, then we have how many people are talking to how many donors and what's your portfolio look like and how much of those donors given in the past. And if we're talking about bringing on new donors, have you identified them? Do you know how much money they're capable of giving? What's your likelihood of getting a gift from that person at that level? And so it's all math and probabilities, which comes up with an answer. And you can never just throw, you need $100,000 more in revenue this year. Where's it going to come from? I don't know. Figure it out. Like, that's not the way you should forecast things. You should say, like, I need $100,000 in this, so we're going to bring on another, 50% person to come on and that they're going to be responsible for that $100,000. And these are the people they're going to talk to. And this is why we know $100,000 is a reasonable goal for them. And I mean, it's got to be totally science-based. You can't make it up. If you're making it up, you're just making your poor development team crazy.
Nonprofit governance.
Nonprofit answers.
Nonprofit board. Nonprofit management.
Nonprofit marketing. Nonprofit resources.
The Alliance for Nevada Nonprofits presents Nonprofit Everything, the podcast about everything nonprofit, with your hosts, Andy Shurick and Stacey Wedding.
It is another day in paradise. Do you know why it is day in paradise, Andy?
I don't.
Because people are listening to us and the Nonprofit Everything podcast. It's a new episode.
It's a new episode. How exciting.
Woohoo! I'm trying to add some energy there, right? So if anyone needed some pep in your step, I hope I just gave it to you. Anyways, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of yours truly, Andy Shurick, my fabulous co-host, and myself, Stacey Wedding. And we are here to answer all of your questions, all those things that run through your head. And I know that you all have a lot of questions. And so I want to ask you to just take one of those at some point, one of them. Text us, email us, submit it on the website, find us on social media. There are so many ways, but just send us your question, no matter how little, big, whatever, like, we love them all. So thank you. And thanks to the Alliance for Nevada Nonprofits. This is a production. This podcast is a production of ANN. And if you don't know much about ANN, I encourage you to go check out their website, become a member, and see what other good stuff they've got going on. I am attempting to start a not-for-profit school and am really having a difficult time. I have my board and the paperwork is filed. I have written over 3 business plans with several different financial outcomes. I am currently alone in this endeavor as the board has full-time jobs. I could use some people to help me get this off the ground. Do you know of any people who specialize in startups related to what I am doing? Thank you.
So this question has so many little bits and pieces in it. I love it. Stacey and I were just talking. One of the things that we haven't really talked about is, like, if you have an idea, you've got this great idea, you put everything in place and you want to start it. What needs to happen between the time that you have a good idea and the time that it actually becomes a functioning nonprofit? This sort of longer term piece. So a long time ago, it was probably about almost 100 episodes ago, we talked to Bob Cushman from SCORE. And one of the things we talked to Bob about, and we'll put a link to that episode in the show notes, and we'll put a link to SCORE in the show notes as well, is this is a group of volunteers who know all kinds of things about business startups and can help you with the startup process. What they don't necessarily know, though, and what you probably aren't going to be able to get from them, is that middle piece, which is, okay, this is the idea. It's a good idea. We know it's going to work. How do I turn it into a building, right? How do I turn it into students showing up for class? Which is kind of a different question. This is one of those answers that's probably going to take us an entire episode too, because there's so many little bits to it. One of them is you are a single founder coming up with an idea. You've put a board together. The board, as you've rightly said, the board are all volunteers. They have full-time jobs, they aren't going to quit their job and stop everything that they're currently doing to help you raise a whole bunch of money, help you find a building, help you develop curriculum, help you do all of the things that you need to do to have a functioning nonprofit. Like that's a heavy lift, especially for something that you can't start small. Many nonprofits, you can start with an idea and a couple of people and a little bit of money. Say you want to start a food pantry. Easy. Food pantry is super easy. You can start a food pantry for $5,000. But you can't start a school for $5,000. You need a lot more money. First of all, you need probably, nowadays maybe not, but you need a physical location. You need teachers. You need materials. You need insurance, all kinds of stuff. And that's a big dollar figure. And that's one of the things that you probably know as you put together your financial projections. There's probably a big piece in your financial projections that says, we need $2.5–3 million just to get started. So probably the question that you're asking, and this is my guess, is where do I get $3 million? Like, I've got this awesome idea. Where am I going to get $3 million? And that's a very specific question that has a very specific answer. So if you're starting a school and it's going to be a STEM school and you want to do all of these cool things related to it, the next step is to start talking to people that have money. Like, find out who's got the money to be able to do this. At this stage, because you're brand new and you don't have anything, I'm guessing it's not the federal government, it's not the state government, it's not the city government, because they're going to want to know that you've got a track record of being able to do this. So you're going to go to sort of riskier locations for your money. You're going to need to go to foundations that are interested in starting schools. You're going to go to individual philanthropists, individual donors that are interested in the exact thing that you're interested in. And when you start thinking about it that way, then it's a completely different conversation. It's not about what the financials look like. It's about, why is this particular thing interesting enough for an individual donor to want to give you money for nothing? Like, why? What is your reason for being? And is that compelling enough to convince somebody who has a lot of money to give you some of it so that you can do this? And that's where it gets really, really hard.
Well, and one of my big questions is what makes you unique? There are a boatload of schools. I know there's a boatload of private schools and charter schools, and those seem to be exploding. Mm-hmm. And so how are you different? Like, everyone needs education, but I still think, if I'm going to be going to a private school or sending, with a nonprofit arm or a nonprofit charter school, I really want to understand what is it this is going to provide me that I'm not going to get through the, traditional public school system. So like, I think thinking through that, you talk about your business plans with several different financial outcomes, but I'd be really curious to know, do your business plans, and SCORE is a great resource for this because they've got template business plans, right? To think through all of those components, not just the financial piece, right? Because that's not going to do it. And talking to, there's other people who have been successful in the community who may be willing to kind of be a mentor or at least have one conversation with you to say, hey, here's what I did when I got started. And there's people you'd be surprised who are willing to take the time to do that. Some who won't give you the time of day and others who will, but you can kind of pick up the phone and reach out and say, hey, can I buy you a cup of coffee and can I pick your brain for a few minutes? I'm also going to guess, not knowing the details about the school, but I think nationally, there's models that I don't know the names off the top of my head, right? But there's, association of charter school models. And like, I'm wondering if you've done any kind of research on some of those and like, if they have sort of some startup support services, to help with it. The other thing, like I was thinking as you were talking, Andy, I get it, the board, right? Board being volunteers and full-time. But I also think it comes back to you being like really clear as you're recruiting your board and as you're appointing a board, being honest up front. Like if you are really looking for someone with expertise in an area to help bring this to life, like thinking about that and thinking about how you can find the person who will give that in your network. And letting them know they're going to be a working board at the beginning. And this is what that means, because it's pretty, whether it's the small startup food pantry for 5,000 or it's a larger nonprofit school model. I'm like, there is a commitment to being a startup board. That is the hardest board, the most challenging board, in my opinion. that you ever have to deal with is because they're having to wear multiple hats, right? Their governance hat, their working hat, they're being basically your staff for free hat. Like, that's really got to be compelling for someone to want to give you that amount of time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you brought up so many different things in that answer. So let's talk real quick about like reaching out to other people that are in the same space that you're in. So one of the really cool things that I've noticed about nonprofits in general is, number one, there are a few people that won't give you the time of day. Like you said, there are people that you'll call and they'll feel super proprietary about their time and their idea, but you don't want to talk to them anyway. Yeah. Like the vast majority of nonprofit folks are super friendly, love telling you all the horrible mistakes you can make and how to avoid them. And the other cool thing about the nonprofit sector is that it's really local. Like there aren't when you think about it, there aren't very many national nonprofits, especially in the space that you're talking about. Everybody's a local nonprofit. So if you want to talk to somebody about how do you start up a brand new school, just go a couple of towns over. And because they're not competing for the same funding that you are, even remotely, they'll talk to you all day. They'll explain to you exactly how they did it. They'll be happy to give you their business plan. This was like so millions of years ago. I worked as a consultant for art museums, and this was the secret. I'm surprised that we even existed, because the secret was like somebody wants to start a new art museum, and they're like, oh, we can't talk to the other museums in town because we're all. So just go to the next state over and talk to that executive director and say, hey, can you just give me everything you have, from your development plan to your strategic plan to your budget? And they'll be like, oh yeah, I'd love to talk about all this stuff. And then you've got a completely like ready to go art museum that you can drop on somebody else, right? And charge them $25,000 for the privilege. So like going out of your local area to talk to people would be delighted to do that. So don't think, and this is a mistake that I think, even for-profit businesses make. They think that their idea is so precious that if they talk to somebody else about it, somebody's going to steal it and immediately do it. And the reality is like, as you've discovered, like a good idea is worth exactly zero. A good idea is where you start, and the work that it takes to turn that good idea into a functioning business is the really, really hard work. And that's what it sounds like you're willing to put in. So go ahead and do that, and don't be scared to share your idea with folks, even locally, and say, this is what I want to do, and this is why I want to do it. Because that's what's going to get you access to those funders, probably.
Yeah. And I agree. And it's, it's like the worst that they can say is no, or I'm not interested, or ghost you and never respond. Right. Like, so right. You're really not out of any luck. And in some ways, it's the greatest form of flattery when you get to a point where you are successful enough, someone's reaching out to you and saying, hey, you are so successful, or you've done I'm modeling some of my, school components after your model. Is there any way I can talk to you about it? Whatever. Yeah. Like that is so flattering.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing is like, so education, I think, is an interesting space, because when you think about it, like other nonprofits, one of the things we always say, like, especially to funders, because funders always get grumpy. There's always one or two that gets grumpy. Like, there's like 11 people in the food security space. Like, why are there so many people in this one space? And the answer is the problem solved yet? Like, do we still have a problem? Yeah. Then why aren't we throwing more organizations at it? So sure, there may be some sort of overlap in overhead, but like you guys are forcing everybody to have zero overhead anyway. So that's probably fine. Could they merge? We've talked about mergers. That's a challenge. So it's okay to have a lot of people in the space. When we think about education, like it's not a supply problem. It's not like, parents of children are going, oh, I don't know where to send my kids because they can just go to the public school. So what you've got a different problem that you're trying to solve, which isn't a supply problem. It's a quality problem, or it's a focus problem, or there's a group of students that's underserved in a particular way, and you have a very specific model to reach that underserved population, that you've got some secret sauce that's going to make these kids that never graduate into kids that always graduate. So figure out what that is, because that becomes really compelling to funders. They want to hear about, like, here's the issue with education that we've identified, and this is how we're going to fix it. So that's your mission, and that's what you should go after people with to try to get that money, and not, I have an idea for a school. Like, yeah, there's one down the street from me. Like, what's different about you? Why should I give you money? I've got one down the street. So thinking about that, like how you're going to talk to those funders is, I think, going to be your next biggest problem. And then, yeah, Stacey, you also mentioned like that starting board is really, really important, and being really clear with the startup board about what they're supposed to be responsible for. Because the mistake we see all the time when somebody picks up a startup board is they don't go for worker bees. They go for people with big names who they think are, can lend credibility to their idea. So if I'm putting together something about education, let's go to a bunch of colleges and pick a bunch of college professors or presidents of banks or, these people, because they lend my idea credibility. Those people aren't going to do anything for you. They're not going to help you at all. The big mistake we see nonprofits make all the time is they want a bunch of elected officials on their boards, like, because they think that's somehow that gets them access to city funding or something, or county funding. And yeah, maybe sometimes, but really all it does is it wastes everybody's time, because this person's not going to participate with you at all because they're on 46 other boards. I am a first-time executive director. For the last few months, I've given verbal ED reports at the monthly board meetings. A handful of our board members recently mentioned that it would be helpful to have a written report. Is this typical to present a written report at each board meeting, and what should be included in it?
So very typical. I have actually not seen, I've never seen it not done, right, in some kind of a written form. Not that it can't be, like you certainly could do it verbal, but I'm going to guess, and that, again, guessing and assuming is never smart. So it's also good to kind of check in, right, to talk to your board chair, maybe talk to the board about what it is that are highlights they want to see in it. Although I'm going to say this with a huge caveat. What I'd rather see you do is I'd rather see you create a written report that is like an executive summary level, high level overview, sort of connecting the dots around things going on with the organization in all aspects, but without getting in the weeds. And that's where people fail miserably with these written reports. They get way, way into the weeds. And the minute you go into the weeds, you invite your board to go into the weeds with you, and you do not want to do it. So it's a little bit like, instead of, here's a laundry list of 50 people I met with and their organizations with no context behind it, I attended these 30 meetings this past month, and that it provides no context. Instead of that, I would do like a few bullets or a summary. Over the past month, I made it my mission to go meet with 10 other nonprofit professionals because I'm looking to explore partnership opportunities XYZ to augment our services, right? Like, so it's sort of like that large picture overview showing you got your head on straight, you've got a strategy, like you're headed somewhere, and filling in some of those holes to provide context for the board, because, right, board isn't doing this every day. They don't remember, like, what probably some of them, if they're not engaged in some way, but on a committee or in some other way in between board meetings, they're trying to remember, what was it I heard last meeting? So being sensitive to that, like thinking through that when you're preparing this, but nothing too long, nothing too fancy, nothing too detailed. That's absolutely started out like that. And then, you could do a check-in and say, hey, did this, I just want to check in, did this meet everyone's needs? Because otherwise, my fear is if you do start from asking them what they want to hear, boards don't always know what to ask, right? And it's not that they're trying to put you through the ringer, but, oh, I would love to know, da, 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 da. And then before you know it, you're writing a book for your report. Andy's laughing. You can't see him, but he's laughing.
This is the worst. So like I think what made me laugh about this question is that a handful of the board members mentioned that it would be helpful to have a written report, which makes me think that the ED was just sort of riffing. They're just like going off on a tangent and talking about whatever. And so
probably.
Board meetings are super formal things. There's like very specific rules about what should happen in a board meeting. And I get a sense that maybe you're not following those. So it's really supposed to be some committee reports. So if you've got a financial statement, the treasurer or the finance committee should be presenting that to the rest of the board. And so that the staff or ED shouldn't talk a whole lot in the meetings. It should be the board reporting on the things that they've discovered about the functional areas that they're responsible for. And so yeah, I mean, there needs to be some sort of written thing. Like maybe you're just like, you're not providing them financials and they're like really freaked out about money. And so they want something on paper to deal with the financials. But it feels like they should be it should be really formal. You should be taking votes on things that you need to be taking votes on. And then the meeting should be over, right? It's not an opportunity to sit and, I mean, unless your organization is really tiny and you need the board to like help you think through things, or you need the board's assistance to make staff activities happen. Board meetings are really just kind of like, here's where we at. Here's all of the things that you guys need to make decisions on right now. Can I get a motion to adjourn? Like that should be a board meeting. And anything else beyond that is that should be in a committee report. It should be communicated to the board at a different time.
And you added something to my thought process, because the thing I think is important to keep in mind is in some of this stuff, I'm a huge believer when I work with organizations to structure better board meetings. One of the things I say is, okay, set the tone and expectation that you read the committee reports and executive director report. And there is no time, there isn't even time unless there is a discussion for feedback from the board to be had. If it is literally just an update, put it on as a report. It's the expectation, whether people follow it or not is a whole other thing. But right, like there's an expectation that board members read it. It's included in the materials in advance. And if someone's got a question, I mean, there's the opportunity, the board chair running a good meeting will ask if there's any sort of questions or needing feedback. But at the end of the day, like save that quality time in your board meetings for those strategic issues, for the financial discussions, for, here's this big problem we're trying to solve right now. Like that is what a good board meeting is done well with that. Not all this report out that everyone's like, yeah, I could just read it, or I don't even have to be in person because I'm going to hear people recite what's in writing. That's awful and boring.
Mm-hmm. So how do you feel about consent agendas?
I'm a huge fan. So consent agendas, right? Like, that idea of take your key reports, those items that are like the items that you don't necessarily need discussion on. And they can even be like things like the minutes from your prior meeting, your ED report, committee reports that don't need any kind of discussion, or examples of consent agenda items. Depending on how your board is and the detail of financials, sometimes there's a financial piece in there, but having sort of that regular routine items that are put on your agenda, the top of the agenda, where the and training board members, you're going to have read this in advance. We're going to call for a vote on any actionable items in the consent agenda. Are you laughing at the reading it in advance, Andy? Because
yes,
that's
I'm laughing
problem.
at the. Well, that's like every time I've tried
right?
to get people to do a consent agenda, like you get so much pushback because people just don't want to be the board members don't want to be responsible for having like consumed the information before they walk into the room or call into the conference call.
Well, and you know what I say to that? Like when that happens, I go, great. Well, then do you want to have, instead of like getting done in 90 minutes, do you want us to be here for 2 hours or 2.5 hours? Like most of the, like, and if you're willing to do it, then fine. We don't have to do a consent agenda. It's just such a waste of time, right? It's like, and I think it's a larger discussion with the board. What kind of meetings do we want to have? Like, and to get to what those kinds of meetings we want to have, then can we all agree that this is how we're going to move forward, right? Like with this consent agenda. Because then it's like one vote, right? Like one either, if there even are items to vote, but hey, do I have a motion to approve consent agenda items? Yes, I got a second, right? Bam. 1 minute and you're done with like 4 items. How cool is that?
Yeah. I think my favorite part of all board meetings is like, can we move to approve last meeting's board minutes? And everybody starts shuffling the papers, reading them for the first, like they've never seen them before. Like I
hate it.
And nobody ever, like occasionally somebody will have a comment like, oh, I was here. I see that I was marked as absent, but I was here. Like that's the only minute change I've ever, I mean, there's maybe other ones that I can't remember, but that's the most common one.
Oh, it totally is. Or, oh, there's a typo here. Oh, like, oh, are you kidding me?
Yeah. Because all that stuff can be bumped onto the consent agenda. And then you're right. It's like, it's one Can I a motion to approve the consent agenda? Second, and all in favor? Aye. Let's go. And you're done with half the meeting in 40 seconds.
Yeah. It's a brilliant tool.
Cue the sad music, because that means another episode of Nonprofit Everything has ended. Thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate that you've taken some time of your busy schedule to hang out with Stacey and I while we answer some nonprofit type questions. Again, this is a production of the Alliance for Nevada Nonprofits, and it runs on your questions. So if you don't send us questions, we don't have anything to answer, and this gets really, really boring, and we'll just post 60 or 30 minutes of silence. I think that would be fun. So go ahead and send us those questions. You can do it at the Nonprofit Everything webpage. There's a Facebook page. There's Twitter. You can pretty much just track us down and ask us, and we will throw that in there. On behalf of Stacey, thanks for listening, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.